Good afternoon, and welcome to this Quincy Institute webinar. My name is Michael Swain. I'm the Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute in the East Asia program. The Quincy Institute is a transpartisan think tank in Washington that's working to build a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. In our research and writing and through our advocacy efforts, we're promoting ideas that move U.S. foreign policy and national security away from global domination and military adventurism and toward a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our country based on the interests of the American people, not the corporate and political interests that have fueled American wars for the last 70 years. Today, we are here to discuss the new book by Charlie, friends, Glaser. It's entitled Retrench, Defend, Compete: Secure America's Future Against a Rising China. It's part of the series of Cornell studies in security affairs. The book presents what I would regard as the most sophisticated, thorough analysis of U.S. security policy toward China that argues for selective retrenchment alongside enhanced capabilities to compete with China. In this analysis, Charlie employs the conclusions drawn from international relations theories about great power rivalries with historical research and a close examination of future projections on key factors influencing the U.S.-China relationship. It's a very timely book because as China's economic and military power grow, as we know, some debates about U.S. grand strategy and China policy are becoming more evident and more pronounced. Charlie's book enters at a time when many U.S. strategists argue for all-out containment, a more decisive pivot to Asia, or decisive war preparations toward China. And yet, at the same time, in recent months, we have seen in the Trump administration, the national security strategy and national defense strategy suggests while China is a serious challenger, it's not a dire existential threat that requires regime change or across-the-board containment. The viewpoint expressed by the Trump administration is very non-ideological, and it's focused more on economic threats, really, than on security. Still, other analysts, myself included, argue for a version of the type of policy that Charlie supports. I would say this book really raises some key questions. What are America's vital interests? How many commitments are we willing to make? What level of risk is acceptable in our security policy towards China? Charlie suggests a reset or recalibration of U.S. grand strategy toward China, prioritizing fewer, more vital commitments and being more realistic about risk and about U.S. capabilities and about U.S. security. Perhaps the central question of the book that would motivate a lot of people in reading it is the U.S. committed to defend Taiwan? Is the commitment to defend Taiwan worth the risk of a war with a nuclear-armed China? So to discuss all this, we have the book's author, Charlie Glaser, and a major China security specialist, Michael Mazar, who'll provide comments on Charlie's book. Now, let me just give a brief introduction to both of our esteemed panelists. Charlie Glaser is a senior fellow in the MIT Security Studies program and professor emeritus of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. His research focuses on international relations theory and international security policy, including U.S. policy toward China, nuclear weapons policy, and U.S. energy security. His other books include Rational Theory of International Politics, Analyzing Strategic Nuclear Policy, and a co-edited volume entitled Managing U.S. Nuclear Operations in the 21st Century, and Crude Strategy. In 2021, Charlie was awarded the National Academy of Sciences William and Catherine Estes Award for behavioral research toward the prevention of nuclear war. He holds a PhD and MPP from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, a BS in physics from MIT, and an MA in physics from Harvard. So both hard sciences and soft sciences, Charlie. Michael Mazar is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He's served as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, president and CEO of the Henry Stimson Center, senior vice president and strategic planning at the Electronics Industries Alliance, a legislative assistant in the U.S. House of Representatives, and senior fellow and editor of the Washington Quarterly at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to coming to RAND, Mike served as professor of national security strategy and associate dean at the U.S. National War College in Washington. He holds an AB and a MA degrees from Georgetown and a PhD from the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs. So with that, we will start. I will give Charlie a pithy 15 minutes at most to give us the core arguments of his book, and we'll follow that up with Mike providing at most 10 minutes. I'm going to be a strict timekeeper on this because we'll have to move along to have a bit of exchange and then hopefully some Q&A from the audience. So Charlie, I hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin by thanking the Quincy Institute for this opportunity to share some of the insights from my book. As Michael's already said, he's given me a tight timeline. So I'm going to move a bit quickly, and I'm also going to look down at my notes a bit more than usual so I can try to stay on track. So I want to start with the framing of the book and give its motivations and analytic approach before I get into the policy recommendations, which is what many people probably want to focus on. The book's framing argument is that China's growth requires the United States to perform what I call a first principles reevaluation of its China policy. The key questions are, what are U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific and how large are they? And given the growing threat posed by China, should it maintain all of its commitments in East Asia? And what military strategies can best protect these interests? In deciding to perform this analysis, I don't presume that the U.S. should trim its commitments, but I want to start with this very fundamental framing to avoid the opposite error, which is assuming that the United States should retain all of its commitments, which is the position that pervades much of the U.S. policy discourse, although not quite the current position of the Trump administration. So in broad terms, a state has a spectrum of options for dealing with a rising power or a peer competitor. It can reduce its commitments via appeasement or retrenchment. Appeasement is designed to satisfy an adversary. Retrenchment is designed to make concessions to avoid conflict with an adversary. Unlike appeasement, retrenchment can work or be effective against an adversary that has unlimited goals rather than limited goals. A state can also just leave its policy unchanged. It can decide what it's doing is adequate. Or it can adopt more competitive policies to deter the rising power. For example, it can increase defense spending. It could expand and deepen its alliances, and it could launch a preventive war to stop the adversary's rise, which obviously in the case of China was not and is not a serious option. And these options can be combined. For example, you could pursue partial retrenchment and combine it with increased defense spending or deepening of alliances. And in the end, this is what I recommend: partial retrenchment combined with deepening of alliances. Okay, so given this framing, then the book asks three interrelated political military questions. What grand strategy should the United States adopt? More concretely, which alliances and partnerships should the United States retain? Second, should the United States maintain its ambiguous commitment to defend Taiwan? If the grand strategy question is we should leave the region completely, then obviously the Taiwan question is answered. But there is the possibility of maintaining our treaty alliances while ending the commitment to Taiwan, which in the end is what I prefer and recommend. And then my third question looks in some detail at how much risk the United States should run in the South China Sea. So those are the three political military questions. Then I turn in the book to the military questions, the military strategy questions. What nuclear strategy would best serve U.S. interests? And similarly, what conventional strategy would best serve U.S. interests? I argue or hold that if the answers to these five questions define the broad outlines of U.S. security policy toward China, and that much of the daily debate, and month-to-month debate, which is very important, actually tries to answer or fill in the details of answers to these questions, but often doesn't ask the basic questions. There are a variety of advantages to considering all of these questions in one place in a book. Among them is that they are interrelated. For example, the strategy the United States requires depends upon its political commitments. So if you decide that you're not going to defend Taiwan, which is by far the hardest military mission, then to some large extent or to some significant extent, U.S. military strategy could be different. And let's say my goal in the analysis is to be as clear as possible. I hope that readers will conclude that I have been. I try to be explicit about the theories that I use and use them consistently. At points, I note where other theorists would disagree, other analysts disagree. And similar, I try to be very clear about the facts that I use and when there are disagreements about those facts. I'm also explicit about uncertainties. Instead of sort of trying to take a position where I think the theory or the data does not support a firm position, I accept that there's uncertainty and try to explain how US policy should hedge or deal with these uncertainties. Okay, so the first thing I do in the book is I look at how dangerous is China's rise. And to answer this question, I employ many theories, but what I'm going to talk about here is defensive realism, which is a structural theory which looks at the pressures created by the international system. Many scholars and analysts believe that power transitions and the rise of a pure competitor, in this case China, necessarily generate intense military competition and are quite likely to lead to major power war. I show instead that if the United States were worried only about protecting its homeland and maintaining its security against Chinese attack, that China's rise would not be dangerous. The Pacific Ocean and nuclear weapons provide the United States with tremendous security, and preserving this security would not require intense military competition. China would and could enjoy similar security and would therefore lack incentives to pursue expansion. So given this view of international structure, it becomes the United States regional commitments that are the potential source of conflict between the United States and China's desire to expand for non-structural reasons. And in the book, although I don't have time today, in the book I go into in some detail what China's goals may be that are driven by non-security reasons, including status, including its national identity and nationalism, and potentially the possibility of expansion because of regime type. But for today, I'm just going to mention that those are covered in a chapter in the book. But the most important thing to stress here is my view, which differs from so many, on the impact of structure. This matters because if you're going to get into a conflict with China, no matter what, because of structure, then concessions would not make sense. You would simply prepare to fight the war that was coming or engage in the competition that was unavoidable. But I find that this is not the case. Okay, so given that, then we immediately turn, or this raises the question of US grand strategy, which is what are US interests in East Asia? Michael referred to this set of questions actually. How large are the threats to those interests? How effective are US options for defending them? And what are the risks? And on this issue, on this big question, we don't need to start from scratch. The decades following the Cold War produced a large and quite good literature on US grand strategy, which I build on. And in the broadest terms, and doing some damage to many of the nuances, I divide the debate between what I call neo-isolationists, which are people or analysts who pretty much want to end US commitments, and deep engagers who want to preserve US commitments. And as many of you know, there's a whole debate about restraint, and I think it uncomfortably falls between these two positions. So here I'm going to sort of highlight these sort of extreme positions, although not most extreme on the spectrum. And maybe surprisingly and confusingly, China's rise strengthens both sets of arguments. China's rise increases the probability of a regional war that involves the United States, which supports the neo-isolationist position for leaving the region. Neo-isolationists worry that our forward commitments will get us into a war and we can best avoid them by staying out of the region. China's rise increases that danger. But on the position of the deep engagers, if we leave the region, proliferation becomes much more likely. The United States security guarantees currently play a major role in convincing or leading Japan and South Korea not to acquire nuclear weapons. That would be a danger of pulling out of the region. And similarly, deep engagers worry that if we leave and then a major power war or a war begins in the region, the United States would rejoin very much like it did in World War I and World War II, and therefore favors staying in the region to reduce the likelihood of that conflict. So both arguments are strengthened, obviously, or ironically, maybe by China's rise. I've long believed that both schools are actually a close call. in a debate, I always thought the neo-isolationist case was cleaner, and I would like to take that debate position, although I tended to stand with the deep engagers. China's rise leaves them a close call, with the exception of the danger over Taiwan. The risks of a war over Taiwan are so much higher than the risks of other wars that I think that if we had to keep all of our commitments, including the commitment to Taiwan, then the neo-isolationist argument is strongest. We should just leave the region. However, if we could break the commitment to Taiwan, but maintain our other commitments, then for a variety of reasons I don't have time to go into it now, I think the deep engagement argument would be strongest. So my recommendation on grand strategy is what I call deep engagement minus. Maintain our alliances, but end our partnership with Taiwan. So then I'll talk about Taiwan very briefly. It's a long, complicated chapter. I think a thorough chapter. I think it's even-handed, but there are many close calls or hard calls to be made. Why end the commitment to Taiwan? I think it's a pretty basic argument. Conventional war over the next couple of decades is too likely. It may not be very likely, but it's too likely, given the potential scope and risks of that war. Assuming the US joins, or if the US joins, the war will be a large, intense war between major nuclear powers. It could escalate in a variety of ways, intended and unintended, which we can talk about in the Q&A. But this would be the first large conventional war between major nuclear powers, and it would be incredibly dangerous, among other reasons, costly on its own terms, but potentially extremely dangerous if it would escalate. Therefore, I conclude that the risks of maintaining the commitment are too large. The United States should end its ambiguous commitment and make clear it will not use force to defend Taiwan. And it should pursue a number of things to demonstrate that this is its policy. Okay, so with that, on Taiwan, I'll turn to the question of nuclear strategy. I'm skipping a couple other questions that I deal with in the book. I'm not going to deal with the South China Sea, and I'm going to skip conventional strategy, but I want to talk about nuclear strategy. The large buildup of China's nuclear force over the past 2 decades has generated substantial attention and concern in the United States by both experts and I think to some extent in the public. It's a very high visibility question. China is on the verge of building a force over the next decade that will be as large and capable in many ways, but not always, as the US force. The most basic question about nuclear strategy, it was true in the Cold War and it's true today, is whether the United States should try to get what's called a damage limitation capability against China. That is the ability to deny it an assured destruction capability, the ability to destroy the United States in retaliation. To do this, the United States needs to target and be able to destroy the vast majority of China's nuclear forces on land and sea, and then would likely want to deploy missile defenses and other defenses against any forces that survive. Proponents of this view argue that this nuclear advantage is required to enhance deterrence of conventional war. The argument is in a world of mutual high vulnerability, a world of mutual assured destruction capabilities, that nuclear weapons don't provide much of a deterrent. And especially, they argue, given the difficulty of deterring a war over Taiwan, the United States needs this nuclear advantage. I argue at some length that this argument is wrong. First, the prospects for achieving a damage limitation capability are exceedingly poor. China is deploying a large and sophisticated diverse nuclear force, and it will be hard for the United States to destroy enough of it to significantly limit damage. In addition, pursuing this type of large-scale counterforce doctrine will contribute to a variety of pressures for escalation, some that could lead quickly to an all-out war, and some that could lead to an escalating bargaining war. And these would be unwarranted given our interest. But maybe most important and lost in this debate is there's actually a very large amount of deterrence inherent in the US nuclear force, even without these nuclear advantages. So consequently, I argue the United States should change its policy. It's a policy that's going to be very hard to change. It had this policy during the Cold War. It continues to have this policy of damage limitation, and instead it should shift to accepting China's assured destruction capability. Okay, so I want to close um, by emphasizing that the United States could strive to achieve more than I've prescribed, and it might work out. It could try to preserve the current status quo, including its commitment to Taiwan, and it could attempt to regain its nuclear advantages. And the policy might succeed. Even with these policies in place, the probability of a major power war is not very high. Nuclear weapons, among other reasons, are likely to keep the peace. However, the risk would be too high. Given the cost of a nuclear war, even if not likely, the current probability with current US policies is too high. So the alternative, partial retrenchment and slowed nuclear competition, strikes a better balance of interests and risks. If a few decades from now a major war has been avoided, the United States will have achieved as much as it can reasonably expect. A major shift in the balance of power will have occurred, and the United States will have protected all of its vital interests and most of its important interests. So with that, I end, and thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Charlie. Good overview of the main points of the book. So I'll turn to Michael now, to Mike. You've got, as I said, about what, 8 minutes or so, Mike, at most. So go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Really delighted to be here, and especially glad to be here with Charlie, whose work on international relations I've admired and used in classrooms for many years, and so it's a real honor to be here with him. And I really enjoyed his book. There's a lot in it that I agree with. I agree that that changing power dynamics call for a reevaluation of first principles in U.S. policy. I agree that the current debate is constrained, as he argues in there, by some conventional wisdoms. I agree with this call for deepening alliances. And I do agree that it is time to engage in more of an open discussion about whether defending Taiwan is in our interest. I'm not in a position that he is to actually advocate for the abrogation of that commitment myself yet, but I think it is a question that demands a lot more debate than it's been getting. So with that sort of general agreement or sympathy, I'm going to raise just a few points that I think are kind of difficulties if we want to move in the direction that Charlie is talking about. First, can we really decide not to defend Taiwan? It is extraordinarily difficult for great powers to make lasting commitments that they will not do things. You can, instantiate a treaty and law that you will defend somebody, but we've already had a couple of big cases, Korea in 1950, Iraq 1990, where the US government had essentially decided not to defend a country, had broadcast that at least partially, and in the 1950 case, quite openly. But then when the invasion occurred, felt that they had no choice. So the risk that a future president would ignore your advice has to be baked into current policy. And the situation I worry about is that one president signals retrenchment, a future president decides they can't follow that advice, and although maybe they don't publicly change the policy, if an invasion happens, they're going to fight anyway. So the risk here is that we end up bringing about the war that we're trying to prevent, precisely because over time, future US leaders can't be expected to necessarily respect this. One other more specific point, Charlie, in the book, you say that on the particular issue of continuing to arm Taiwan, do we still sell it weapons, potentially give it weapons, engage in training, whatever? And you admit in there that that might, I think, as you say, eviscerate the advantages of reducing the commitment, but you recommend it anyway. And in fact, unless we repeal the Taiwan Relations Act, we are required by law to sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. So that strikes me as a big challenge of what do we do about that? Do we keep engaging with them? China's going to demand that we stop those transfers. If we don't, then we've lost some of the value of it. But if we keep selling them, we're sort of signaling a commitment. Second, is it really impossible to defend Taiwan? I found some arguments a little bit on both sides of this. I get that Chinese power is growing. There is this general argument that's made that, because of the changing balance of power, we better abandon Taiwan because we can't defend it anymore. But there is mixed evidence about this. And modeling and all kinds of wargaming and other analyses do come to different conclusions. And we haven't even really begun to try to reinforce our posture in a serious way in that area. Taiwan has certainly not begun, and given the latest activities in their legislature, maybe a while before they begin to make the bigger investments in defense that they need to. But if that were to happen, I'm not sure that it's impossible to defend, especially if we get some level of internationalization of the response. A question that occurred to me while reading the book is, isn't the best outcome that we deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan? That is the ideal outcome. The question is whether we can still do it. And so the Taiwan commitment is only risky if we think deterrence is impossible. And I feel like there's so many uncertainties involved with that. We could argue that, yeah, the balance is shifting, but I didn't find a kind of definitively compelling argument that there's no way we create a situation in which they are deterred over time. I would say most China experts I know believe the Chinese leadership would prefer a non-military solution to this problem, right? Without going to war. They have a long-term policy in place to try to put Taiwan in a position where they gain that kind of leverage. That's their preference. So if that's their preference, our traditional view has been, we just got to keep kicking the can down the road and wait for some better situation, a post-Xi leadership, some other kind of change. And for the next 10 years, I'm not sure why that's impossible, given the military balance there. Third, China's ambitions. So this is a big part of the debate about Taiwan. Obviously, if they get Taiwan, does that enhance their ambitions? Would it make them go after others in the region? You make an argument at the beginning that China's greedy ambitions are part of the reason why we have to shift our policy, because they want Taiwan. But I'm not sure of the compelling evidence that those greedy ambitions are limited to Taiwan or even the South China Sea. They have ambitions in the East China Sea. They have ambitions of political control elsewhere. I'm really not one of those who believe they're going to go and invade other people in the region, attack Japan. But history is full of examples of great powers having their sort of appetite whetted by successes. You suggest in part of this argument that backing off Taiwan will moderate US-China relations, but I'm not sure if that's true. I think the competition is now primarily techno-industrial rather than military, plus which, if we are doubling down on all their other alliances in the region, they're not going to like that. I don't think we should care. We should still do it. I agree with you on that. But there are many tension points in their relationship other than Taiwan. And so I don't see that as kind of a magic wand that makes tensions go away. So backing away would then not mitigate the rivalry, but leave China in a stronger position. And fourth and finally, the endless credibility debate. Nobody can really resolve this one, but I just have to say we've done 4 or 5 studies on this that have been published, where we spend a lot of time talking to people in the region about this contingency and related things. And I have been consistently surprised by how many people in surprising places other than Australia, Japan, say, if you just abandon Taiwan, the impact on US credibility would be devastating, absolutely devastating, and it would make it hard for others to trust you. Now, my view is, where else are they going to go? Japan is not going to abandon the US alliance because it is in their interest to continue it. So the practical effects on the US alliance structure might be modest, but it is a risk. And I think I found the discussion in the book on this more theoretical than kind of current and grounded in the actual thinking of people in the region, which is mixed, I know, but there's a lot of words. There's also the TSMC issue, but I'll leave that aside. So finally, I'll just say, is there a middle ground where instead of trying to formally say we're not going to defend Taiwan, we leave the ambiguity policy in place? We do defense modernization, which is going to help us with Taiwan because we're going to do it anyway. But at the same time, we take steps to much more strictly respect the one China policy, to reduce the provocative engagements with Taiwan that arguably some US administrations have been doing. And we try to lower tensions over it and create this situation where China has this great incentive to do things slowly and avoid a war, where they don't feel like they have to act quickly because the United States is pulling Taiwan away from them. And then you leave the US president a choice. And Pat Porter and I made this argument in a Lowy piece a few years ago, called like a Taiwan a third way or something like that, where we said basically the goal should be to allow a future president to decide to step aside if they believed at that time it was the right choice, rather than have us absolutely locked into defending Taiwan. So I feel like there's a next step in the process of reconceptualizing our commitments, perhaps, that is short of abandoning Taiwan, that respects some of these other risks, but that does reduce the risk of war and creates flexibility for a future president, if they so chose, to say, you know what, this is not in our interest. And frankly, I think given the reality of presidential decision making, I think that's about the best we can do. So I think your book raises critical questions. It's something that folks involved in this issue should definitely read. A lot there I found to agree with, and just a few questions that I have.
Thank you, Mike, very much. That was great. Well, as you heard, Charlie, that's a pretty extensive set of questions that Mike has raised. About the believability of any U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, given the variability of U.S. administrations. And then, is it really impossible to defend Taiwan? Doesn't it seem like that we could maintain the deterrent capability? And then China's ambitions go well beyond the issue, or the frictions go well beyond the issue of Taiwan. There are many other tensions, so why put so much emphasis on the Taiwan issue? And then the credibility question. It seems so strong that so many actors in the region would feel a U.S. movement away from Taiwan would just panic so many people, it'd be almost impossible to guard against. And then Mike offered his own sort of middle ground assessment between view and that of current U.S. policy. Anyway, I want to give you a chance to make any kind of brief comments in reaction, and then I think I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. There's been a couple of interesting questions. So anything to say in response, Charlie?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. These are all good and hard questions, and I certainly respect the idea or the ideas that Mike has raised about trying to find an in-between way on Taiwan, because we do have interests there, and I understand, and I'm very reluctant to not protect them. But I'll go through his points. Some I have pretty strong responses to, and other ones I just accept. So I think there is the danger that we would get into a war even though we pulled out. And I do think that is potentially the largest danger, even though we've broken the commitment. I think that is the largest danger. I would say, though, that possibility to some extent, I think, also does cut against your in-between option in some ways, which is that if the United States really shouldn't be coming to Taiwan's defense, which we can argue about whether it should, but then I think it will take a very strong position over time to get the United States into that frame of mind. And so leaving it open and continuing to maintain the expectation that we may come to Taiwan's aid, and then leaving that to the president that faces all the standard bureaucratic pressures and public pressures, actually leaves the United States in the situation where it's more likely to intervene than it should. And so I think that the danger that you point to there has a danger on the flip side of trying to thread the needle the way that you have, but I understand that position. I think you've overread or overstated my position, I'm sure not intentionally, on whether Taiwan can be defended. I actually tried to be pretty clear in the book. I think that I agree with you that the data is mixed, and I think maybe the best wargaming suggests that the United States has a reasonable prospect, even maybe a good prospect of defending Taiwan in what would turn into potentially a long war. But I also think, and if you look at some of the wargaming exercises and so forth, there are a variety of ways conditions under which the United States does not do so well. And so if China believes it might face those conditions, for example, that Japan does not is not willing to use its forces to help the United States, or does not at the very beginning let the United States fly out of its bases, or if the United States is slow to respond to Chinese mobilization, which would be a lot of good reasons to do, then our prospects are worse. So I definitely don't take the position that it's impossible. What my view is that there are plausible scenarios that a Chinese military leader could explain to the president, to President Xi, that we have a good chance of winning, um, and that we think we're in one of those situations. And that in that case, China might be able to roll the dice, particularly if it really has come to the conclusion that there's no peaceful resolution um, for integration with China. So I accept that it might actually be possible to protect Taiwan. I don't for the United States to defeat a Chinese invasion. I think though that the danger is on the flip side, that it's not certain, and that under various political conditions, Chinese leaders might decide it was worth the risk. On China's ambitions, I agree with you. I think China may have ambitions beyond Taiwan. And in fact, I both look at this both theoretically and at what China experts have said, and there's really quite a spectrum. It goes from people and experts that believe China is quite determined to have a sphere of influence in East Asia and push the United States out, to other people, experts who believe, yes, China might like to have the United States leave the region, but it's not willing to pay a high price. Um, and so I think U.S. policy needs to hedge against that spectrum of possibilities because I'm not a China expert. My own feeling is more on the dovish side, um, but I think if we maintain our alliances um, and increase our capabilities in many of the ways that you said, including like deploying all the types of anti-ship missiles and ways to defeat A2AD and so forth, that we just have an excellent chance of defending um, our treaty allies. And in combination, I don't, China may want to take those countries or conquer those countries, but it seems unlikely. And if there's no reason to value them nearly as much as Taiwan, so the combination of much lower value, much greater US military prospects for success makes me think that we can actually defer and deter those attacks. And so I think that the policy of keeping the alliances and reinforcing them um, strikes a good balance. I think that yes, China may have other ambitions, but the only one that we probably can't deter of the big commitments is Taiwan. And then we can get into the details in the South China Sea. But I think in the South China Sea, there is some danger, once again, that we exaggerate the extent of our interests. And I think we need to put some limits about on what we're willing to defend if China wants to exert greater influence in the South China Sea, assuming it doesn't pose direct threats to our treaty allies. And then finally, on credibility, I mean, I think that there are these credibility arguments in both directions. You're right. Maybe I should have said more about the current debate. I think it would create great fear and concern among our allies, but I think you touched on the key point. One, they don't have a better option. I mean, I think right now, I think you'll see what the Europeans are doing when they have doubts, and I think that you'll see an even greater scramble to maintain the alliance rather than to undermine it, or rather to leave it if the United States were to start to raise doubts about its commitment to Japan and South Korea and Australia and the Philippines. But also, the United States can do a variety of things over time, including by making clear that it's committed to those allies, by increasing its capabilities to defend them, by deepening the exercises, interoperability, diplomatic continuity, and so forth. And I'll just end by saying my confidence on credibility does not apply to the it's just done by the current administration. Because when I think about our ability to maintain our credibility, it's all under a leadership it's trying to make clear that we have placed great value on our allies in the region, not the Trump administration, which is sort of generating, for a variety of reasons, great doubts. So in the hands of the Trump administration to make this move, I think would create severe credibility fears, and could lead to the proliferation dangers and the decision to go it alone that I think a sounder U.S. policy could avoid. So thank you very much for those questions. I hope that at least the answers are partly on point.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Well, rather than going back to Mike on this, let me bring in some comments and questions by some of our viewers. And actually, they're similar to some of my own questions. and things that I've had to grapple with as well in making a similar kind of argument to Charlie's. And one of them is the whole question of the process of making this policy transition. You address in certain places in the book, Charlie, the need that you can't just simply pull out and abandon Taiwan. Taiwan still remains important. It still needs to have U.S. support. And we also need to be able to ensure against the loss of credibility by the United States. So how do you see this process working itself out? Do you see that the process should involve a whole range of different activities designed to reassure the Chinese while still maintaining deterrence, reassure the allies, to some extent even reassure Taiwan while you're putting in place the necessary conditions for transitioning away from Taiwan as a policy of non-intervention? And then at the very end of this process, the president makes some kind of announcement about U.S. policy. How do you see the process working, Charlie?
Yeah, so I have a few answers, a few points on this, but none that are, not a full mapping. So I think on your point about reassuring China in the process, I would just echo Mike's point about clarifying and not weakening the U.S. one China policy. I think that the first step about this process is to have the debate, is to really open up this question and try to see if people, get enough people on board that we can go, if there's way to go forward with it and not to reverse and to, consistently make this. So we need to have a debate, which is very different than the debate that we've had, although I respect your work and many others that have talked about this, but still a minority voice. Another thing we would need to do in the process while we're having this debate is explain to our allies how we see Taiwan as distinctly different from them and demonstrate that. A key point is that we understand that China does not believe they are part of China. It believes Taiwan is part of China. And so the risks are much greater with respect to Taiwan. And that's why we're making that move, and it does not apply to them. And then we continue a variety of policies interrupted by the Trump administration to prepare those the allies, tell them that we're thinking about this, deepen in the ways that I explained, so that the turmoil is not too great at the time of the decision. We also, as Mike mentioned, there is this issue of the advanced semiconductor chips. We're starting to solve that problem. We need to solve it. We need some number of years, but not decades, to create sufficient insulation. I would not delay until the problem is completely solved, but I would certainly hope that in the relatively short term, I think we are, and the Biden administration put us on a good path toward getting to a place where our dependency and the global dependency is much smaller. The question of whether we should arm Taiwan in preparation for ending our commitment is a very tricky question. In the end, I decided, at least as a transition, that we should arm Taiwan. Here, my thinking is as much, frankly, about defending Taiwan, enabling Taiwan to defend itself, as it is to not embolden China. I think that we need to make clear that we're not backing down simply or easily, and that it's in our interest for them not to conquer Taiwan and integrate it into China. But I think that's a very close call, because I think, as Mike suggested, there are many issues in the U.S.-China relationship. I think that with time, it will be the only real deep issue is Taiwan. But to the extent that we continue to arm Taiwan, obviously that issue, we'll be standing on a different or wrong side of that issue. And, the technological and economic competition is real, but in a world in which security threats are much smaller than other countries' economic growth, and our dependency on them is also much smaller. And so if we could eliminate, I don't mean to be overly optimistic about this, but if we eliminate what I believe is the only deep geopolitical tension, then over time, I actually think that there is the possibility that the economic and technological competition will proceed, but in a much less dangerous way. And then eventually, I think Taiwan would just need to, they would have watched this debate. They would have been consulted over time, and at some point, U.S. policy just changes. And there's at that point, we need to not reassure them that they're on their own. We can continue to arm them for some amount of time, but we're really changing our policy, and hopefully, the Chinese would not invade, and they might not for a variety of reasons. I don't want to sugarcoat it and say they wouldn't or anything like that, but they probably will use all sorts of coercion. But that's so in broad terms, that's what I think would be the necessary components. I don't think it would proceed neatly, but it would be very dangerous if we don't have enough consensus in the United States to move forward in a relatively steady path. I think for reasons that Mike suggested.
Right. Well, an issue here, of course, is the question that Mike raised, which is how much could we expect a movement by the United States to a non-intervention strategy towards Taiwan to remain that strategy over several administrations, where you could get administrations that would just simply reject that strategy, and that the Chinese would assume that that could very well be the case, that a later administration just won't accept what the previous administration has done. And so the Chinese should go on assuming that the United States, in fact, will intervene in a Taiwan conflict. Do you see a problem with that kind of situation?
In some ways, if they assume that we will, that's the best of all worlds. Then they'd be deterred by the possibility, and hopefully, if they weren't deterred, we wouldn't intervene. So that's a win-win. The danger is that they decide that we might not intervene, decide to attack, and therefore and then we do intervene. So and Mike sort of pointed it, that's the worst of all worlds, is if we say something we end up not meaning and they believe us. And I guess I think that there's sort of countervailing dangers. I accept that that's a real danger. But I also believe that if we continue to prepare our military forces to protect Taiwan and say that we may come to Taiwan's aid, and then in a severe crisis say to the president, what do you think? That there'll be tremendous pressure to intervene. The president has the option, but I think it'll be much, much harder to not exercise it. So what I'm doing is I'm weighing the danger of maintaining the option, and to maintain the option, you've got to sort of prepare for it, which means, and you don't, you can say to the military, yes, we may or may not use this, but they have to be in the frame of mind that this is the mission we're going to perform. And I just think that I make a similar argument in the book about continuing to, pursuing a damage limitation capability, even when you're not sure you can get one, a kind of bluffing or holding options open, but then failing to really understand that even though you've been pursuing this policy action, proceeding with an attack or with a defense is not the best option. So I accept that that's a danger, but in accepting that danger, I think you have to accept the other danger, which is that holding the option open makes it too likely that we would intervene even if we shouldn't. And I think if they attack, we shouldn't. So it's very hard to bluff. In the book, I go into this question, why not bluff? The best option is a successful bluff, right? You successfully convince them that you will defend Taiwan. If deterrence fails, you don't defend Taiwan. I just think that's very hard to do successfully. And then you have the downside that I've already mentioned, which is you intervene when you shouldn't.
Okay. There's another issue which we haven't even touched on at all, is the values issue. And one of the questions we have is that if the U.S. will in effect abandon Taiwan, or it be seen as being abandonment, don't you think the U.S. will lose its stand as a major democracy who defends other democracies around the world against autocracies? Will it lose its legitimacy to promote democratic values around the world, such as advocating for freedom of speech, assembly, free elections, and so on? What's your take on this democratic values aspect of a non-intervention policy, Charlie?
Yeah, I like the question because I feel badly for the reasons that the question suggests. Although that it's not, it is in U.S. interest to promote democracy and maintain democracies but only when it's not too risky. So I think on this, the risks are just too high. And I think you sort of, hope to wait. I mean, one is you hope to wait and maybe, I was going to say fight this battle, but those aren't good words, support these goals sometime in the future. I think the risks aren't warranted. And what the United States should do is support democracy around the world when the risks are appropriate. And it should continue to do that. And it should make clear why in this case it retrenched. Now, with this administration, it's a whole other issue. The Trump administration is damaging U.S. democracy and a variety of institutions that are consistent with freedom of speech and human rights in a way that do way more damage to the U.S. image than anything about Taiwan. So that ending the commitment in Taiwan would do. So I mean, I think to the extent that that's a concern, which is not to say that one negates the other, we have a much more imminent set of threats to U.S. democracy. But also in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, there are places where we can quite reasonably support democracy at relatively low risk, including at places in Europe, countries in Europe, where we're not doing that. So let's do that where it's relatively safe and the prospects are relatively good, and accept this cost, even as uncomfortable and as unfortunate as it is.
Mike, do you have any thoughts on this issue of democratic values?
So on the one hand,
please jump in if you have any other comments you'd like to make.
So on the one hand, Charlie's right. We don't defend every democracy in the world. In the Cold War, based on risk calculus, whether democracies or states in the Soviet sphere where rebellions were suppressed, we don't always do that. Taiwan is a neon light of this, and I think one of the real challenges of this is to imagine the practicalities of how this would play out if the United States broadcast, a conclusive statement that it would not defend Taiwan. In some fashion, you are then going to have Beijing going to Taipei and saying, okay, guys, because I think the prospect of arming Taiwan to defend itself, absent any other power coming to help it, is a non-starter. If I were in the Taiwanese leadership, I would not immolate my country in a fruitless war if the United States had said, we're not coming. So I don't think that's an option. If it's not an option, Beijing goes to them and says, let's begin the process of absorption. You can take 10 years, we can draw something up, but guys, this is happening now. And if Taiwan resists, there will be increasing coercive pressure. China could put on a blockade. Presumably we wouldn't respond to it because we're not going to war for Taiwan. And meanwhile, because of the presidential decision-making dynamics we talked about, Beijing will have an enormous incentive to resolve this issue before any change of administration. So you're going to create whatever period, if this happened at the beginning of administration, a 3 or 4 year period of intense risk of war. Now, if it's within that administration, they've decided not to defend them. But this isn't a case even of a sudden out of the blue Russian invasion of Ukraine, despite US warnings, where we decide not to be engaged in the actual defense of Ukraine with US forces, which I think was a wise choice. This is a situation where our policy choice would invite a campaign of Chinese aggression, coercion, and potentially ultimately aggression that would imprison a country of 23, 24 million people. Now, if the United States decides that a war would still be worse, that is a potentially legitimate strategic decision, but we can't kid ourselves about what this would look like. And the effect on US credibility, I think, would be way more intense than some of the other choices the US has made not to go to war, because we will have created the situation and then we will sit by and watch, potentially, as China puts the screws to Taiwan. That will be a very difficult thing to do. And somewhere along that road, even within the same administration, it wouldn't surprise me if we lose the strength of our convictions and say, okay, well, actually, China, you've now gone too far. We really would prefer if you not do this or that. And if we have created a situation where they really are convinced we aren't going to respond, we'd have very little leverage at that point. So it gets back to your question about, or the question about the process of making this happen. It is clearly a time for us to rethink a lot of our international commitments, make sure they make sense. Taiwan is one of those, but practically working this out is devilishly hard if the United States decided to go in that direction.
Can I just
Yeah, I
briefly
think.
respond? So I think that
Go ahead, Charlie.
I agree with Mike's scenario. I mean, I think that I don't mean to I think that there is a likelihood that at some point China would use coercion and force if it needed to integrate Taiwan. So I mean, I think we have to accept that that's the likely scenario and ask if we want to um, are willing to accept that. I don't like it, but I've concluded I'm willing to accept it because I think the risks of continuing are too high. I will say it's, it's interesting to think about, and they're not exactly parallel, but a good thought experiment is to say, why is nobody saying we should come to Ukraine's defense? There's very little effort on the ground to say, well, Ukraine should not be allowed, Russia should not be allowed to invade Ukraine. So what we're doing is we're not using we're not directly fighting in Ukraine, although you could argue we are. But I'm just, in a sense, like why should we be willing to use force to protect Taiwan, but we're not willing to use US and NATO forces to protect Ukraine? I think a little bit of what we're seeing here is there's a little bit of a status quo bias. Like we know the risks are too high in the case of Ukraine to go in and fight. I would argue the risks are at least as high if we end up defending Taiwan. Now, of course, the difference is the one war is happening, the other war we're trying to deter. But nevertheless, it is interesting to think that one through. But I mean, I think it'll be very bad. The likely outcome is very bad if we end the commitment to Taiwan. I just think the possible outcome, the other outcome is sufficiently bad, which is to say a war between the United States and China, that the expected value of it is even higher.
Of course, there is the argument that, and I refer to this in one of the pieces I've written on this, that the Chinese will look at a U.S. non-intervention policy if they really do believe that that is what the United States is trying to put in place as a support for a very long for their general policy of reuniting with Taiwan in as peaceful a way as possible and with as little coercion as possible, because that plays to their interests to want to do that. And the United States has basically taken itself out of the game as a major player in a war. And so the prospects for a peaceful resolution of the issue become much higher. Now, the issue, of course, becomes how long will the Chinese pursue that policy if the Taiwanese completely reject any and all overtures? And there you get down to the question of whether or not the Chinese would alter their interaction with Taiwan in ways that lower the sense of threat that the people on Taiwan feel about reunifying with mainland China, and whether or not, if they were successful in doing that, that you could get a process of transformation here that is not a steady increase of force on the or a propensity to use force on the part of the Chinese. It might involve a steady effort to try to change attitudes on Taiwan in the whole process to unify between Taiwan and China. So it's not necessarily, I'm not sure I completely buy Mike's argument about the Chinese being committed to a way that would necessarily lead to growing levels of outright force or coercion, rather, that could lead to force. I think it's possible you could get something that moves in the opposite direction, but it would depend a lot on the impact of the interactions between China and Taiwan and how the Taiwanese react. And there the question becomes, should the United States encourage the kind of dialogue between China and Taiwan that is reducing Taiwanese resistance over time without China looking like it's going to just imprison, as you say, the people of Taiwan? I would argue, yes, the United States should encourage that process if it is indeed one that seems to result in lesser sense of alarm on the part of Taiwan and more peaceful overtures by the Chinese. But we don't know. At this point, we can't say. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, I'm sorry to say. There is so much more that needs to be said about this topic, but this is really an excellent effort at discussing some of the, I think, the most important issues. And Charlie's book really does merit some very serious reading and consideration by both policy people and by average Americans. Even though there are some theory chapters there that they might find difficult to get through, But I think in general, it is an excellent examination of a lot of the issues that are involved here. And the most important thing I think that Charlie can say at this point in time is that, and Mike has said the same thing, we need a better, more open, more transparent debate in this country about what exactly our interests are with Taiwan and in Asia more broadly, willing to risk to defend them, in what way, and what is our outcome? What is our best optimal outcome for the situation regarding U.S.-China relations? So, I mean, if that debate could expand and develop in Washington and elsewhere, I think that would be an excellent impact, at least one of them, of Charlie's excellent book. So, before I let you go, though, I want to thank you both for participating, Charlie and Mike. It was an excellent discussion. Let me just mention our next webinar will be tomorrow at noon Eastern Time, a discussion with Stephen Kinzer and Anatole Levitt on the history of U.S. regime change. And you can register for that now by going to our events page at quincyinst.org/events. You can also subscribe to the Quincy mailing list from our homepage, quincyinst.org, so you'll receive invitations to all of our events and be able to follow our work. Thanks again for participating and for the audience engaging. I'm very sorry I didn't get to a lot of the questions. There were a lot of different questions here, but I think we touched on quite a few of the concerns of the questioners. But thank you all for participating and joining our efforts to promote U.S. foreign policy away from the prospect of greater war towards more restraint and diplomacy. So thank you, Charlie, and thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you very much.